I want to make 3 points. First, the European experience. You noted that there were too many permits issued, and our study in Europe indicated that they essentially had bad data because they got some bad data from the applicants, if you will. And I want to point that out to some of my colleagues because we are endeavoring, Tammy Baldwin and myself, to pass a bill this year that will start the registration process this year so we can gather good data even before we implement the cap-and-trade system, hopefully in 2009. And I just want to emphasize your testimony in that regard about the importance for us to get good data when we start. And we want to start that process this year. So thank you for bringing that up. In your report, you talked about a couple of mechanisms for increasing clean technology research and development. And you addressed something we call a renewable portfolio standard, and a second something you call in Europe a feed-in tariff. I just want to let you know I'm introducing with some of my colleagues today a bill that will essentially implement a feed-in tariff system in the United States. It's called the Renewable-Energy Jobs and Security Act because we think that will produce jobs and security. I noted in your report that in evaluating those mechanisms, you concluded that both had been proven effective in the European experience, and that concluded that the feed-in tariff, which is essentially a guaranteed price for clean electricity, was the most economically beneficial, most efficient mechanism. That's heartening because you were here today and we're introducing our bill today, so it's a happy coincidence. I just wonder if you may comment on why that is and what your findings were in that regard.
I think it's largely to do with the importance of clarity in long-term planning for investment decisions. And a feed-in tariff does give the person making the decision, for example, to invest in solar, confidence in the long-term price that they will get as a return on their investment, on the electricity they'll get for their investment. Of course, there will be revision clauses in those contracts, but the revision clauses are transparent too. Whilst there will be some uncertainty resulting from that, the investor has got an understanding of what that is. I think when you have renewable portfolio standards, that isn't quite so clear. A lot depends, the price you're going to get, a lot depends on exactly how those standards function. And I think there's greater uncertainty involved for the investor in that. So from the point of view of transparency and clarity for all those involved, I would share your preference for feed-in tariffs. And on your previous point, I would strongly recommend that in putting your policies on cap and trade in place, you learn from some of the mistakes we made in Europe.
We intend
you really are. Yeah.
We intend to go to school on you, and I'd love to add your name as a co-sponsor of my bill, but we just don't let lords to co-sponsor bills in the House. So that's the one handicap we have. I want to ask about the. I want to test drive sort of a theory that I have on the ultimate benefits of a cap and trade system. There really are two parts, in my view, of a cap and trade system. One is it is a self-restraint on one's own national contributions to CO2 loading, which is beneficial. But I really believe its more important part of industrialized nations, particularly the United States' adoption of one, is to the extent in which it drives clean energy research and development. Because ultimately, even if the United States restrains itself to zero CO2 emissions, unless the China and the Indias of the world have access to new technologies, solar thermal, enhanced geothermal, sequestered coal, you name it, unless they can have access to those technology, we're all toast. And so I really believe that the more important part of a cap and trade system is to drive investments to develop these clean energy technologies, which frankly we can sell, to the extent they're not pirated, to the developing world. So my view is we get a self-restraint, but a self-development is actually more important reason for having a cap and trade system ultimately when it comes down to the world's CO2 loading. That's a theory I want to throw out. I just appreciate your comments on the thoughts.
Cap and trade with auctioning of permits and carbon taxes are in some ways quite close, but there are important differences. Cap and trade gives you clarity on the quantities. You're much more sure about the overall emissions you're going to be making, but of course there's some uncertainty on the price. A tax gives you the greater certainty on the price of carbon, i.e. the tax, but it gives you greater uncertainty on the quantity. And I think uncertainty on the quantity is worrying in this context where we have to move quickly. Secondly, on cap and trade, you have the advantage that if you open up to trade elsewhere, you not only bring your costs down or get more emissions reductions for the money, for the usual reasons that international trade allows you to buy where the product is produced most cheaply, but also you have a chance to bring the developing world much more strongly into the story, because they will recognize if they have very cheap ways of cutting back on emissions, they can get resources on the carbon markets to help make that happen. So I think it will be a very important part of the glue of a global deal. So cap and trade, if opened up in the right way to international trade, does enhance the prospects of a global deal in a way I don't think that carbon tax does. You could fix it so a certain amount of the revenue is promised and so on, but I'm not sure that would be credible, because that would be government-to-government transfers rather than the private sector buying those reductions on the market. So for those two reasons, clarity on quantity and the role in international trade, I think cap and trade does have some advantages. I think in its driving of R&D, I mean, you could argue that a tax on carbon drives R&D also, but I do think a cap and trade with clearly announced future reductions of the kind that you've been discussing in your bills does actually give the greater clarity, and people, I think, have greater confidence in that environment about what they have to plan for. You know, governments under pressure can change taxes. Long-term plans, which everybody in the industry is plugged into, whether everybody knows where they're going, I think are more robust to short-term political pressures, and that's very important in this context.
Well, you just reminded me of another lesson from Europe. When we talked to the European folks, they repeatedly stressed that a cap-and-trade system was not a silver bullet and had to be part of a coalition of other mechanisms, including feed-in tariffs, including efficiency standards, including good public transportation systems, including, you know, good public planning of our growth and the like. And their message to us was, don't think a cap-and-trade system is going to be the only thing. You've got to have a panoply of these things to address the issue. Would you share that?
I definitely would, and I'd add to that list strong public support for research and development.
I wholeheartedly, ours is pathetic. We're going to increase it dramatically, I hope. Thank you for your testimony and your work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inslee. Well, Lord Stearns